Scano and welcome everyone. We are grateful that you're able to join us today for an important conversation. My name is Susan Hill and I'm the director of the Center for Indigenous Studies at the University of Toronto. And I'm a citizen of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy from the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. To begin our session, we have asked Eileen Antone from the Oneonta or Oneida Nation, member of the Turtle Clan, to open for us following the traditional procedures of our people. Eileen?
Saguli swagwe go. Onya da aga, jitbat gat dundi. Jut sani tne, Haudenosaunee neon gats, Galek Weesax neon gats, Eileen Anton, Sloni Gik neon gats, Noel ni Wagadelodon. And so today I bring greetings to you in the language of my ancestors, the Onya people. And I tell you, I'm one of the original peoples from Turtle Island, and I come from Onya near London, Ontario. And I tell you that one of my names that I use when I'm working with the university is Galit Weesax, because that was a name given to me by one of the elders. And Galit Weesax means she who gathers information. And so I've been gathering information for many, many years. And so now I'm going to share some of that information that I gathered from our peoples, the Onya people, the Ongwehongwe. And so as we begin, our elders tell us that we begin any gathering with the Thanksgiving. And so today I give thanks for each and every one of you that have joined in this meeting. And so as we gather our minds together, we give thanks for all of you. We give thanks also for Mother Earth, because we know that, again, without Mother Earth, we would not be here. And so we give thanks that Mother Earth continues to carry out her duties and responsibilities while we are able to meet here. We give thanks also for the water that flows on Mother Earth. Again, we know that without water, there would be no life. And so we give thanks that the water continues to carry out its duties and responsibilities. And we give thanks for all of the water animals, because again, they are so important to our lives. We give thanks for the plants that grow on Mother Earth. We know that each plant, right from the smallest blade of grass to the tallest tree, is important to life. And so we give thanks for these plants. And we give a special thanks for the medicines that our people use, the tobacco, the sweetgrass, the cedar, and the one more, I can't remember what it is now. Oh, sage, that's the one, the plant from out west. I just give thanks for these medicines. And in our community here in Ontario, the Ongwehongwe people also give thanks to the three sisters, the corn, beans, and squash, because again, they were the sustenance that kept our people alive. And so we continue to give thanks for them. We give a special thanks for the maple tree that again brings us sweet juices in the spring that are the medicines that are necessary for our communities. And so as we gather our minds, we give thanks also for the trees that produce the oxygen for us, because without this oxygen, there would be no life. And so we have a reciprocal relationship with the trees when they take our breath and give us their breath. And so it's really important when we talk and think about our relations to all of creation. And so as we gather our minds, we also give thanks to the animals that walk on Mother Earth, right from the very smallest crawler to the tallest and biggest animals. Each are important to the people in their respective regions. And so as we continue to in this meeting. We give thanks that they continue to carry out their duties and responsibilities as we are able to meet here. We also give thanks for the birds that fly in the sky. These birds go from place to place, carrying out their duties and responsibilities. And we give a special thanks for the eagle who flies high, the eagle who flies, who sees far. Because again, we know that what we do today impacts the 7 generations into the future. And so we give thanks for this gift of vision that the eagle reminds us that we have. And so as we gather our minds, we give thanks for this vision, for this eagle, for this opportunity to meet together, to talk about the relationship of people in Canada, the relationship of the settlers and the people that, the original people from Turtle Island. And so as we gather our minds together, we give thanks again for the things above the earth, for the thunderers that bring the winds of change, that bring the water to refill our systems here. Because again, we know that it is refreshing when these thunderers bring these elements to our lands. And so as we gather our minds, we give thanks for the thunderers. And in our community, the stories tell us that it is important for us to remember that these thunderers keep the monsters underground that should not be here with us. And so as we gather our minds, we give thanks that the thunderers continue to carry out their duties and responsibilities while you are able to meet here. And so as we gather our minds, we give thanks also for our elder brother, the sun, who brings the energy to the earth, who keeps us alive with the light, because we know that there would be no light, there would be no life in darkness. And so as we gather our minds, we give thanks for our elder brother, the sun, as he carries out his duties and responsibilities. We give thanks also for our grandmother, the moon, who regulates the waters and the coming of children. Because again, we remember it is these children into the 7 generations that are impacted by what we do today. And so as we gather our minds, we give thanks for our grandmother, the moon. We give thanks for our ancestors because they remind us the times of the ceremonies that need to happen in our communities, the times of planting and harvesting. All of these things are important, and our ancestors give us guidance to when these need to happen. And so as we gather our minds together, we give thanks also for the messengers that brought messages from the Creator. We know that, again, these messages, each in their regions of people, they are important. And in our region here, Skunyan DeLeo brought the message from Creator that we are to continue using our languages, that we are to continue doing our ceremonies, because these are important to our lives. And so as we gather our minds together, we give thanks for these messengers that remind us that we are to be able to get along with each other in a good way. And as we gather our minds together, we give thanks for the guardians in the 4 directions, because I know that they give us guidance and protection as we walk on Mother Earth daily. And so we give thanks for these four guardians. We give thanks again for each and every one of you that have joined us for this time of for this teaching, so that again we have more information to work with. And so as we gather our minds, we give thanks to Sigwe Ndiza, the Creator, for all of these things. And if there are things that I have missed that you remember, give thanks. Yawa, Miigwech. Thank you.
Yawa Galiwizaks. So I have the honor of getting to moderate today's session. And I just want to give a very brief overview of what we're going to be doing for the next hour and 20 minutes. Hopefully, if you've tuned in, you already know that you are attending a teach-in session called Solemn Promises on Stolen Land, Policing and Treaty Breaking on 1492 Land Back Lane. And I am thrilled to have with me 3 of my colleagues to talk about this particular issue, and also to give context in other ways, both in terms of Haudenosaunee thought and philosophy, as well as the context of the Canadian state and Indigenous nationalism. So first, our first speaker will be Ms. Courtney Skye, who is a fellow with the Yellowhead Institute based out of Ryerson University. Courtney is a Haudenosaunee citizen from Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, and is also an active journalist doing freelance work on a number of projects. She's led policy development for the public sector at local, provincial, and national levels. And that includes a framework for youth development, a strategy co-developed with Indigenous partners to transform the governance, design, and delivery of child and family services, and a strategy to end violence against Indigenous women. Courtney strives to end all forms of colonial violence experienced by Indigenous peoples. Following Courtney will be Professor Kevin White, who is a Mohawk from Akwesasne with family connections as well with the Tonawanda Band of Seneca. He's an assistant professor in the Department for the Study of Religion and the Center for Indigenous Studies at the University of Toronto. Kevin started working here last year and previously spent a number of years at the State University of New York at Oswego. His research focuses on Haudenosaunee creation, narratives, and storytelling as a way to better understand cultural knowledge and history of those who have long called Turtle Island home for generations upon generations. Kevin aspires to help students and others face squarely the complicated pasts we all share. And you can find more information about Kevin on different U of T websites. And our third guest is Professor Dale Turner, who is Anishinaabe from the Temagami First Nation, and also a professor at the University of Toronto in the Department of Political Science and the Center for Indigenous Studies. And Dale is a well-regarded and respected author and political theorist. And he will be sharing some context that he's garnered in his life of work, including potentially maybe some insights from his time with the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. So with that, I'm going to pass things over to Courtney, who is going to talk about experiences she's had, particularly in terms of a recent arrest and encounters with the OPP, and to help us understand the ways in which policing is being used as a tool of the colonial state and by all of the governments of Canada in order to maintain control over Indigenous lands that they erroneously now occupy. Courtney?
Way Scano, everyone. Courtney Gasso. My name's Courtney Skye. I'm a research fellow with the Yellowhead Institute, as Sue said. I'm also an Ongwahoe language student at the Six Nations Polytechnic. So I'm a student learning my Indigenous language. I've also been a policy developer for a long time. I've worked in public policy for about 7 years. And so my work centers around the intersection between gender, land reclamation, and governance. And that's really what my interest is in as a researcher and as a Haudenosaunee citizen. I come from a matriarchal society that's experienced many different types of colonial disruptions. And so with my work at Yellowhead, studying injunctions, studying land use, it was pretty obvious to me that I should know what's happening in my own territory and in my own backyard. And so I became engaged with the land reclamation work that's happening in my territory. I traveled to the land reclamation site, which is just off of our reserve, and spent time there understanding what the land issues that were at play within the specific jurisdiction, within the specific territory, and then also working to understand like my own local history. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that first. So I'm a Mohawk Turtle Clan woman, and being Mohawk, being Haudenosaunee, we come to the Haldeman Tract and under very specific circumstances and under very complex circumstances, because the Haldeman Proclamation follows the Sullivan Campaign and the Treaty of Paris. Haudenosaunee people and the Mohawk people were allies to the Crown, and following the Sullivan Campaign, were chased out of our territories by an act of genocide before being allies to the Crown by George Washington and Sullivan. And so part of my understanding of my own history, understanding my nation's history, has been a part of understanding how did we come to be at Six Nations, and how did we come to be at the Grand River, because it is a very specific parcel of our broader territory. And the story of Six Nations is really a story of finding a place of solace for Haudenosaunee people, and specifically for Mohawk people. And so I, locate myself as a descendant of people who experienced genocide, as a survivor of a genocide, and the fact that, my existence as a racialized Mohawk woman means that my existence is inherently political, and my identity is inherently political. And so I engage in politics in that way. And that's how I, approach all of my relationships. And so a lot of my work intersects with those identities, and understanding the biases that inherently fall within that. So one of them being that Indigenous people have a right to exist, which is very controversial in a settler state. So I'm going to share with you some of the experiences that I've had recently, and then just some of how it connects to some of my broader work. So I'm going to start with that. I'm going to share with you the screen because I really enjoy PowerPoint presentations. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about 1492 Landback Lane. And here are all the social medias. I just wanted to thank Desmond Cole, who started off today at the Scholars speaking about amplifying the work that's being done at 1492. And I wanted to share with everyone their social medias. The first one, landback6nations@gmail.com, is where you can send e-transfer donations. They've asked that folks indicate whether or not they would like to see the donations go towards the legal fund, or if they would like it to go towards the building fund and the survival fund. It just helps them understand how to break down their donations. And also, due to the recent criminalization of supporters of the camp, they've also set up the second email, Landback Lane Legal Support at Proton Mail, which is where anyone who has visited the camp or been there, who is concerned about their potential legal risks, to coordinate with the organizers for legal support. They also have a Facebook page and a group on Facebook that is doing a fundraising auction, which is available. They are on Twitter, and of course they are on GoFundMe. So a brief timeline of where we're at today, which starts with the Haldeman Proclamation, but it starts with specifically around the 1492 Landback Lane location, is that in 1853, the land there was sold to a third party, and it's there that it's been the duty of the Crown to consult has been extinguished. And so this is a specific tactic that's used by the Crown, which is a little bit different than unceded territory. And I think a lot of folks would have understanding of, impact benefit agreements and things like that. But I'm just going to talk a little bit about what it means when the Crown sells land to a third party and how that has impacted what's happening here. So in 1853, when this land deal was made, it was made with 11 chiefs, which is not consensus and was not within the traditional structure of the Haudenosaunee. And this is the item that's under dispute now. In 1924, the traditional governance system of the Haudenosaunee was replaced by an imposed Indian Act system. And there were, I think, 12 positions that were open, and fewer than 30 people participated within the first vote, even though there was around 3,000 people that lived in the community. Fast forward many years of different types of oppression and different types of interference in the community, the imposition of the Indian Act. Eventually, we come to have a federally regulated avenue in which communities can assert land title or seek remedy for these historic injustices, called the Spec Claims Agreement. And so the Spec Claim process for Six Nations around the Oneida Township was filed in 1990. And so we're coming up on 30 years of dispute and negotiation, specifically through one policy process around this specific territory. You can see here the Haldeman Tract, which is in the green, and the current Six Nations Reserve. Six Nations is Canada's most populous First Nation. There's 27,000 band members, and only about 14,000 of them live on the reserve. Six Nations is quite densely populated, and they have a housing shortage. And so the community is essentially bursting at the seams. Property for sale in the community goes for as much as $50,000 an acre, and land around the territory as well is quite a premium. So there are some properties that are for sale adjacent to the reserve, which are in the millions of dollars, because there's just so much demand for reserve land in Six Nations. There's also some relevant case law. So in 2000, there was a Chippewa Sarnia case that from the Ontario Superior Court that said land cannot be returned once it's been sold to innocent third parties through an illegal land surrender. And so this case has had pretty significant impact into what's happening today. Fast forward to 2013, a series of community meetings were held in Six Nations to discuss the potential for the Mackenzie Creek development. Those meetings happened, there was a series of 3 meetings. There were 78 people that participated. 66 of those people voted against this agreement, and then still it went forward. So in 2016, the elected Band Council signed an accommodation agreement for 42 acres, and they received $350,000. In their rationale, they've cited this Sarnia case in the sense that a third party is not doesn't have a duty to consult with the First Nations, and so there's really no recourse for the community to protect land from development once it's transferred to a third party. There's no real legal recourse for them, and so the only thing that's available to communities is a legal land defense, or a land defense that has been deemed illegal. So the amount that's given here, the $352,000, that is not enough money to even buy one home on the proposed development site. So on July 19th, land defenders stopped the development. Currently, there's a plan for 1,200 homes. 200 of them have been sold or have down payments for them. And there's been a moderate level of development. In what was formerly pristine farmland, they've scraped away the layer of topsoil. And so the land that the land defenders are on is basically like a desert, and it's exposed clay. And there's been these moments of like revelation with folks that are there of reflecting back on the creation stories and these ancient stories that form our worldview that we've persevered through colonialism to continue to tell our children. And they talk about how our creator made us from clay. And so it's on this exposed topsoil, on this exposed clay, that the land defenders are directly touching and sleeping and existing on that clay that we are formed of. And so it's a really profound kind of spiritual experience to be there, because this is the clay that we're made of, but it's also the clay that they are camping on, they are cooking on, they are building on, and that they are playing lacrosse and engaging in other ceremonies on. On July 31st, an interim injunction was granted for the land development. And then on August 5th of this year, the OPP attempted to clear the development. What followed was, the land defenders that were at the Mackenzie Creek development, they were forcibly removed by the OPP. And there was this kind of spontaneous response from the community to reassert their presence at the camp. So even though all the land defenders were arrested, the OPP was unable to hold the land. And within 7 hours, land defenders were back and had reclaimed the property. And this is where my interest and my research interest really peaked, because I actually wasn't in the territory when this was going on. I was away camping in Nishnabek territory. And so my main avenue of hearing about what was going on in my home territory was through the media. And so it was through these images and through the media coverage that I had to dissect what was happening in my home community. And these are the images that continue to be shown about my community. And so I just want to talk about some of these images in a way that maybe people don't understand or don't understand the layered complexity of it. Is, first of all, these are very young men that are here. These are young Haudenosaunee men, and they are my age or younger. And so a lot of folks that are older talk about 2006 and previous land reclamation work that has happened at Six Nations. And I think it's important to contextualize this because the land defenders that are here were children in 2006. I was in high school, and some of these young folks that are at 1492 were even younger than that. Some of them were have very few memories actually of what it was like to live pre-2006, or even the conflicts that happened in between them. These are young people that have lived their entire lives with these unresolved issues and land issues within the territory. And I also was able, through conversation and interviews with land defenders, to understand what was happening around some of these instances. So just in the bottom left corner here, where we see these young men walking on the road with the flames behind them, I asked, why were they walking that way? What was happening there? And they said that there was a woman, a Haudenosaunee woman, who tried to walk into town, that she wanted to go and to get something to eat, and that she wanted to go to the local Tim Hortons, which is just kind of behind where this was. And that people, settlers, white people in Caledonia, stopped her. They stopped her from being able to enter the town, and that there was a risk to her personal safety, that she had not anticipated that there would be violence or resistance from average people in town, and that she was being hassled and unable to get service. And so these young men walked up together to go support this woman so that she was able to get something to eat. And this sensationalization of these young men with their face covered becomes a threatening image, when it's actually young men exercising their responsibilities to ensure the safety of Haudenosaunee women. And so after their violent arrests, after the Haudenosaunee were forced from the land, less than 48 hours later, they were expected to appear in court. I don't know how many people can can form a legal defense after being tased and shot at with rubber bullets, but that was the expectation that was placed on land defenders. And on August 7th, injunctions were extended to all roads in Haldeman County, and also from the CN Rail, which were blocked following the arrest on August 5th. In between then, people at Landback Lane have been de-escalating. So the roads in Caledonia have reopened, the CN Rail has opened, but there's been no, but the injunctions have not lifted. And so within Haldeman County, currently there is no ability to protest or block any roads. And those continue to exist against Jane and John Doe in the community. On September 2nd, which was last week, arrests of supporters began. So on September 2nd and up until today, between 3 and 5 people who are not from the who for the most part are not from the territory, but have been supporting Landback Lane were arrested, including myself. So on September 3rd, I was in a vehicle with a friend, with Dr. Hill. We were parked alongside the Grand River, and it was then that a vehicle was stopped and I was removed from the vehicle and I was arrested for mischief and disobeying a court order. It was a very difficult and traumatic experience, and reflecting on it has been quite difficult because, you know, this is my area of study, this is my area of expertise. And I think maybe I had come to peace with understanding that because of that, I would eventually be criminalized. But to be arrested on the banks of the Grand River, which is a territory that was promised for Mohawk safety, was especially difficult and is still difficult to kind of digest. So we now are in this space of waiting for court dates and waiting for injunctions to be heard. The next court date is October 5th. Land defenders have called for expressions of support and basically saying that this court process and this approach to reconciliation, which is the violent removal of Indigenous people and forced development on their territory, is not an appropriate place for us to be in. It's it's very unfair and unjust, and so they're calling for support and action across the country on that day. There's been a number of expressions of support. This one was written by my colleagues at Yellowhead Institute, talking about the use of injunctions. Injunctions are a blunt weapon used to deny Indigenous jurisdiction. Yellowhead research shows that almost 100% of injunctions filed against First Nations by industry and government involve resource extraction or development, and most are granted in their favor. What follows is the militarization of Indigenous lands and the criminalization of land defenders. I have those stats here for you from Yellowhead. So a review of over 100 injunctions in Canada found that 90% of injunctions that are filed by governments against First Nations are granted, and 81% of injunctions filed against First Nations by corporations were granted. In comparison, when a First Nation attempts to file an injunction against a corporation, 81% of the time, those First Nations are denied. And when injunctions are filed against the government by First Nations, 82% of the time they are denied. And so we see this legal function really serving an express purpose to mobilize the military, or to mobilize the OPP or RCMP or whatever police force to forcibly remove Indigenous peoples from their territory. This is a statement from Concerned Haudenosaunee Women that was published by the Yellowhead Institute. Haudenosaunee women stated that we are the rightful title holders, and injunctions deny us our inherent right to our land. Injunctions also authorize police violence against our people. Our sovereignty is inherent, while Canada's perceived authority is the product of violent colonialism and genocide. Injunctions seek to make this reality invisible, a tool of the court to sanction more violence and dispossession. These matters are complex, and we do not believe this court is the appropriate forum to deliberate our concern or resolve our issues, and we will continue to resist the criminalization of our people and illegitimate development of our territory. And we call on the Crown, our allies, to stop the use of injunctions against our people. And then I'm going to be self-referential here in a bit of my defense to point to some of the work that I've done as a researcher and as a writer, but also to talk about this connection. So we have the studies, the finding, following the National Inquiry on Missing Indigenous Women and Girls, that makes this connection to the disruption of governance and this overarching approach taken by Canada to disrupt Indigenous communities in order to sow violence that legitimizes the destabilization of our community and the lack of recognition of our inherent governance systems. So the report affirmed what Indigenous people have long understood, that the violence they experience is a product of settler colonialism. The continuation of the Canadian settler state requires the destabilization of Indigenous communities. A part of this destabilization has involved rampant gender-based violence to uphold the legitimacy of the settler state's rule over land and water. The inquiry has established that violence in Indigenous communities and the ongoing refusal to recognize Indigenous-led ways of knowing or ways of governance reinforce one another to the benefit of the settler state. And so finally, I'll maybe have one more reflection after this, but this is really important. And I think it's very important to understand that this is a part of an ongoing, long-standing push by Indigenous women that happens in many other spaces where Indigenous women and Two-Spirit and queer people are leading land reclamation actions. And I firmly believe that they'll continue to do that, and that Indigenous women like myself are targeted for police violence and criminalization because Indigenous women are so powerful. And it's evident at 1492 Landback Lane, where even though there's this violent imagery in the media about what's happening, anyone who's been there knows how profound it is that in this space of impending police violence, that there is so much love and safety for the people that are there. And that the folks that are there, even though they are portrayed to be violent and volatile, are really carving out space for safety that is safe for women to express their opinions and their leadership, that's safe to conduct ceremony, that Black Haudenosaunee people are safe there, that gender diverse Haudenosaunee people are safe there, and that it's this kind of space where communities are able to exert control in their own jurisdiction, where they're able to carve that out. And so this is something that I wrote as well for Briar Patch Magazine, that in the face of displacement, criminalization, and violent victimization, Indigenous women have maintained spaces of safety and resistance. Indigenous women claiming space in policy and decision-making, especially where control over lands and waters are at stake, is critical to stabilizing Indigenous communities. And so while the Canadian state may seem like an immovable object, what we must recognize is that Indigenous women are an unstoppable force. And in this space of tension and conflict, Indigenous women are driving social change and political discourse that seeks to end colonial complacency and redefine our relationship with the settler state, fundamentally changing itself in the process. And so I really want to maybe not focus on the fact that I'm a researcher and that I've a journalist and that I've experienced this type of criminalization. And I really want to highlight the fact that, the state is attacking and criminalizing people who have done things like bring food to land offenders, that people who have not stayed at the camp have been arrested, that there's been almost nearly 20 people who are now facing criminalization for existing in this space where it's been pretty obviously unjust, but state sanctioned in its rule, or I guess in its ability to be seen as legal but not just. And so it is complex to understand what's happening. And so I hope that like the folks that are also on the panel will help in a discussion around on what's happening, and that people that are viewing today take an interest in understanding this complex history and how we are responsible now today to right these injustices. So that's it for my piece. I'm just gonna see if Sue's ready to come back and move to the next speaker.
Now, so much, Courtney. You've provided us with an excellent context for understanding the complexity of these situations, and specifically what's happening with 1492 Landback Lane. Next, I would like to invite Professor Kevin White to provide some additional context around Haudenosaunee thought and philosophy for us.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Courtney, and thank you, Eileen, for all of your good words and the way we've started this morning. I wanted to kind of begin with situating where some of this thinking comes from for me. Being cross-appointed to the Department for the Study of Religion and Indigenous Studies is a unique intersection for me because most of my research is situated in the creation story. And so those words that Eileen opened with, the Thanksgiving address, are often described as our original instructions from the story of creation. And when we examine this criminalization of people over land, when we examine what's going on now, what's gone in the recent past, and what's arguably gone on for close to 500 years or over 500 years, we really have to kind of dive deep into what accounts for these clashes, not just legally, not just historically, not just culturally, but in some ways morally, ethically, and philosophically. And I think part of the cultural clash, at least from my perspective, is centered and based in two very fundamental different worldviews of the natural world and what it means for humankind. I really relish the opportunity to study origin stories, to study creation stories, because they really tell how specific cultural groups understand how the physical world came into an existence, how humans and humanity came into existence, and perhaps most fundamentally important, how humans are to relate to that natural world. And so in Haudenosaunee perspective, in Ungwahoi perspective, and indeed I would argue for many Indigenous nations across Turtle Island or North America, that connectivity to land is very fundamental, and there is some form of thanksgiving or greetings and acknowledgement to the natural world for all of the bounty that it gives us, that it sustains us. And those are usually specific language choices that are used in this kind of context, in relating to the natural world and relating and understanding the relationship between humans and the natural world. And so I often try to think about it in that context of where the early settlers and the early colonists came in and how they perceived the natural world. And from a largely, in some ways, Western Judeo or Western religious theocracy kind of thinking, there's this notion that the land is a resource, that it's a commodity, that it's to be harvested from and utilized properly, and that through hard work combined with the proper utilization and caretaking of the natural world, then one will eventually earn a way back into a kind of utopian ideal that that was the fall of humanity, or the fall of humankind out of this utopian ideal. And so this really sets the stage in some ways for that age of colonization that's usually kind of mythologized in history books as the age of exploration. And it allows the creation of extraction economics. And in that kind of fundamental way of thinking, if you view the world as a commodity or a dead thing, then there is righteousness in some capacity of using the lands that others are not using properly per your worldview. And so that creates the ability for militarization and what we would today call policing and criminalization of actions that are contrary to a specific worldview. And I mean, it all kind of feeds in and onto itself in a lot of ways, that there is, through the proper extraction of resources, materials, goods, labor, then that creates wealth, and wealth in some essence creates power. And sometimes with that power comes fear. So then we see this notion of guardians or militarization or police forces that kind of are created to protect the resources or protect the lands. But it's not really about the land, it's about the wealth that's being extracted from that land. And so it was really interesting to hear Courtney talk about the clay we are made from, because that is an Indigenous worldview. That is a way we see ourselves as connected to not only the natural world, but to each other and to the environments around us. And that is a common way of situating yourself and explaining yourself as who you are and who you belong to, what clay you come from. So these are important nuances that really beg of deeper study and deeper thinking in a lot of ways. And I would also say about, in some ways, Western theological constructs can be argued to essentially create humans outside of the natural world or apart from the natural world in some capacity, that they are, I believe some of the language in the King James Bible says given dominion and stewardship over the earth. And those are very debatable points, because dominion means to be over or to essentially control the earth. And that's not an Indigenous framework. That's not an Indigenous way of thinking. So in the Haudenosaunee story creation, all of this was put here for humankind to benefit from, to sustain themselves, to remember their obligations to each other as humans, and to remember their obligations to the natural world. And it really comes from those words that Eileen spoke as part of our protocols to begin with, of how we relate not only to each other, but how we relate to the natural world. And it is in this kind of unique discussion and discourse that I think a lot of this fundamental clash happens, both philosophically and intellectually, and of course, legally and politically. Because if we see the land as a commodity-based thing for extraction economics, then you don't see value in the land of itself. You only see what you can gain from it monetarily or resource-wise or material-wise. So this presents that kind of clash that was, for me, is present in the early stages of colonialism as it is today. Indigenous thinking asks us to think about, and I'll speak more from a Haudenosaunee perspective on this, about reciprocity, about a reciprocal relationship to the natural world. And I use an example with my students that in some ways, the Indigenous frameworks would ask people to allow the animals that feed off the other crops that are growing in the field to just do that, because that's part of the reciprocity. That's a relationship not only between man and natural world, or humans and natural world, but humans and animals and the natural world. And so in Indigenous narratives of creation, each part of creation, each part of the natural world has their own role and their own obligation to the natural world to fulfill and to carry on. And point in fact is, in some cases with the study of Indigenous thinking, it is humanity that often forgets their roles, that often forgets what their instructions are, that forgets the protocols by which we are supposed to act in accordance with the natural world, because we see ourselves as part of the natural world. But I really want to kind of fixate on this reciprocity, because it's not just about taking material from the earth or leaving it with the earth. There's a relationship there, and that's the fundamental part of this that is unique to the understanding and thinking in this. And it forms the basis of treaties and understandings and negotiations that existed between Indigenous nations before contact. I'm thinking specifically of the treaty, the treaty belt, the dish with one spoon, because this is where Indigenous nations could coexist together, and that they realized that there was enough for everybody, and everybody had a right to it. And there were usually just a small handful of rules that kind of govern that belt and that dish with one spoon that really bears underscoring in this. And the first point is that you're only to take from the natural world or from the dish what you need. And you are to always leave something for the future generations and for the future people coming from beneath the earth, from the clay. Another part of it is that you're going to leave the dish clean. In other words, you have to leave stuff for not only the future generations, but you must caretake of that land and those resources so that all of the natural world benefits from it, because you're all part of the circle in that capacity. And so that's a really fundamental thing to really think about in the dish with one spoon. And then for me, the last part is that this relationship between nations, that you understand that nobody has sole right or ownership of the land. You have a shared responsibility to the land. And that's, in contrast to Western thinking, that's a very fundamental shift in thinking. I mean, I think about how wealth is defined in modern Canadian society and American society by ownership of land, because if you have that land, then you can produce something out of that land that earns you earns money for you. And if you have money, then you can acquire more land, and then you can acquire more resources for the making of money. And so we see this kind of cycle repeat itself over and over and over again in these contests between Indigenous thought and Western thought, and how we really engage with this. And, you know, that is a really powerful image to see the Haldimand Tract in its entirety of what was originally termed the Haldimand Tract. It was a massive piece of land along the Grand River. And so understanding this history is imperative to really think about how that notion really goes forward, you know, in modern context, because Courtney's right on spot with how the imagery feeds into itself about how Indigenous peoples are violent and problematic. And really, what are they doing? They are simply defending their lands. They are defending their relationship with nature. They are thinking about all of this in that kind of capacity. And you know, the unique way of putting Shoshone thinking is that women do own the clearings and men own the forest. And there's these deep-rooted philosophies that are still present in today's generations and will be present in future generations, just as they've been acknowledged in the past generations. And I'm going to kind of wrap up and conclude with that point, that I really want you to think about the difference between a reciprocal relationship with the natural world and other parts of humanity and community and nation states versus this criminalization and militarization and enforcement using fear to create extraction economics, whether it's land or the sale of land, whether it's the resources out of land. It's all important things to be thinking about. So I'm going to turn this back over to Susan and let the other panelists continue on. Thank you.
Now for that, Kevin. Next, we have Professor Dale Turner. And before Dale comes on, I just wanted to let folks know that we are trying to save some time for questions. So there's a process, I believe, that you would have gotten instructions for through the YouTube channel for submitting questions. and we'll be working on trying to answer some of those. For folks whose questions we may not get to, we're going to use those questions as a means to do some later writing in response to the issues that have arisen in this session and in connection to 1492 land back lane. So I'm going to turn it over to Professor Turner now. Dale?
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great honor. Am I heard?
Yes. You're muted, Dale.
A couple of points that I could make to sort of fill in, I think, some of to help contextualize, I guess, some of the other points that were made. I appreciated what Kevin had to say, and I think my comments kind of flow out of this. I think it's really important to have a look at Section 35(1). Aboriginal rights are protected in our Constitution. So the second part of the Constitution is devoted to Aboriginal rights. Section 35 says the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. It's interesting to point out that originally there was a small a used in Aboriginal. Now it's a capital A, and that shift, I think, is really significant. And I think, just to make a kind of a long story short, to make a particular point that I want to make about how the courts and how in Indigenous politics we characterize, particularly the source of Section 35 rights, is important that we go back to the Delgamuukw case in 1997. And this is an important case because it relates to the Wet'suwet'en politics that are, of course, going on now. And I think that this issue, the Wet'suwet'en issue, is a family resemblance to what's going on with the Haudenosaunee, which is a family resemblance to the Oka conflict in 1990, which is a family resemblance to the Ipperwash issue as well, which we've just passed that anniversary, all having to do with governments not listening to Indigenous peoples in and on their own terms. And this problem exists at different levels of analysis, and in particular in the way that we understand the meaning and content, as they say in law, of Section 35. The Delgamuukw case was a real opportunity for the court to listen to Indigenous peoples in and on their own terms. The Wet'suwet'en and the Gitxsan they had their own, Johnny David, they had their own elders and their own medicine people speak in their own languages, offering up evidence for why, within their own ways of thinking, they owned their homelands. And the court could have incorporated Indigenous languages into the way that they understand or developing a theory of Aboriginal title, a right to the land itself. But they didn't do that. In ordering a retrial, they set aside the much needed conversation, dialogue over how Indigenous voices, Indigenous understandings of their rights and nationhood, how they can be accommodated within Section 35. And they set that issue aside. And I think one of the things that came out of the Delgamuukw in 97 was this rise of this impact benefit agreement culture in the government, that we didn't need to have a conversation with Indigenous peoples to understand where they're coming from. They're lucky enough to have rights that are protected in the Constitution. The problem is, what's happened is there are two different ways that we understand the meaning of Aboriginal rights that are playing itself out in Oka and Ipperwash and here in Caledonia. And so the two ways that we characterize Aboriginal rights as a form of constitutional right is, one is the delegated approach and the other is the inherent approach. approach. Now, there are two assumptions that since 1982 that have guided every single Supreme Court decision on Aboriginal rights. The first is the supremacy of state sovereignty. This is taken as a given, it's immutable, and it's not up for negotiation. So any understandings of Indigenous nationhood or determining the meaning and content of our rights to the land, this language of rights as in a constitutional right, need to be tethered to, need to be given. The language that we use needs to be on a foundation, right, of this supremacy of state sovereignty. The second part of this, which I think goes to the core of some of the practices that Kevin was referring to in terms of Indigenous practices, is this commitment, this idea that individual rights are sacrosanct to building a democratic society. It's built on this foundation of individual rights being protected within the nation state. Within this, of course, we have Section 35, the existing Aboriginal treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. And through the course of many decisions, really this starts with the Oka crisis in 1990, in some sense culminates in the relationship between Delgamuukw and RCAP's final report, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, is this response to the Oka crisis that ended Delgamuukw, which is Canadians need to understand their history. We need to understand how the state was formed, and in the treaty relationship, which is central to understanding the legal and political relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state, Canadian governments, is this recognition of this inherent right? So the delegated approach is what the Supreme Court has adopted, assigning delegating rights to Indigenous peoples in virtue of the supremacy of state sovereignty. So Section 35 needs to be tethered right to this. On the other hand, they're using this language of the inherent right, of which this term, our rights inhere in us as Indigenous nations. What does that mean? It means that if you go back to our Indigenous traditions, our Indigenous languages, which is what the Gitxsan Wet'suwet'en brought into the court of law. They explain themselves in their own languages. That gets set aside. A more practical, pragmatic approach to accessing land, setting aside these philosophical, spiritual issues for Indigenous peoples, I think has triggered, one, the resurgence movement, I think is part of this, but also this idea that Indigenous spirituality, which is central, right, to thinking about the meaning and content of our rights, Indigenous spirituality, in a sense, is this kind of philosophical justification, right? That's the source of legitimacy for Indigenous nations. And this language that we use in English is around this language of spirituality. And I think what we are seeing is all along the way, these forms of resistance and this language of resurgence as a way that Indigenous peoples are turning back to the land. They're turning back to the land. They're relating to their lands in their own traditions, their own ways, their own languages. And now this is what we're seeing coming back out of the communities. And it's manifesting itself in the conflict with the Wet'suwet'en. The hereditary chiefs have never stopped making the same kinds of arguments. When they meet people on the blockades, they speak their Indigenous language first and foremost, because that's the source of their authenticity, legitimacy. And I see this in Caledonia as well. I heard the Premier say, and his commenting on this, on the arrest, is he finds it deplorable that that people would violate the rights of what he calls future homeowners, and he claims that we're one nation with one law, And this is a mythology. This is what an entire Indigenous intellectual community has been wrestling with for decades. And what I see is this shift by invoking our own languages, but what goes along with that is our own ways of thinking, right? Indigenous ways of thinking are being brought into a politics. That's why we're hearing sort of Indigenous languages and terms. Tino Rangatiratanga in New Zealand as in indigenizing, so to speak, of this political discourse. So, and of course, this has also been protected in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Article 25. Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationship with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied and used lands. So there's this recognition of this language of the inherent right of nationhood, of Indigenous spirituality being central to the well-being of our relationships to land, while at the same time within this delegated view that is what has evolved in the language of law, dictates that these understandings become constrained. And I think that's where the politics is kicking in, that the judicial approach, in some sense, Section 35 is kind of coming to its end, where it's not a recognition of the distinctiveness of our rights, but it's a recognition of Indigenous law, right? And this is what Indigenous women have been bringing to these conflicts. And the Wet'suwet'en example and the Caledonia example are case in points. So I guess what I want to point out is there's a kind of legal history here of the Supreme Court interpreting the Section 35, but it's fallen safely within this kind of delegated approach while using this language of the inherent approach that Indigenous peoples have to get to the point where they set up a blockade in order to have the government listen to them. So I'm getting wound up. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to some of the questions.
Now for that, Dale. Of course, you've stepped into territory of great debate and contestation, and that's I think the perfect place for us to be right now. In terms of this discussion, of course, you're well aware of the fact that the general position of the Haudenosaunee is that it's all fine and good if you have Section 35 and whatever else Canada might want to have in their constitution, but that your constitution doesn't apply in issues of treaty matters. In other words, that's how you govern yourselves, and we have our own rules about how we govern ourselves. And that's been the continual position of traditional Haudenosaunee leadership for at least over 400 years now, right? And it's certainly, I think, the position that the thinkers behind 1492 Land Back Lane are informed by and coming from. While there's certainly been a resurgence for many Indigenous peoples, we are fortunate in our community at Grand River that there are some families and some people who never lost language, never lost that relationship to land. And for those of us whose families did get lost, we have models to follow, who are our neighbors, who are the speakers in our longhouses, who are our teachers in our language classes, who are teaching our children in our community schools, that we have folks who never were lost and who've been able to maintain things for us. And that now we do have a resurgence of people picking up their responsibilities so that it's not just held by a small group of people who've maintained that knowledge base for all of us. So with that, I want to open the floor to questions. I understand there's been an active commentary on the YouTube channel, but I wanted to start by posing a question to Courtney and thinking about how she contextualizes this in the bigger picture of Haudenosaunee land responsibilities. You've touched on that a bit already, but I wanted to know if you can sort of give maybe another bigger picture piece in thinking not just about those of us at Grand River, but about Confederacy-wide.
Yeah, I think it's important that we think about all of these things, all of our ways of being and our land as well, in the idea of it being an inheritance, and what does it mean to situate ourselves as children who are taking on an inheritance that's left to us by our parents and our grandparents. And I think about that specifically about, you know, what does it mean for us to be, what does it mean to be children? And in Haudenosaunee law, what does it mean to protect the inheritance of children that are coming, and how sacred that is? And that's a shared responsibility that we all have, that many Haudenosaunee have reiterated as being, you know, one of the top reasons why they are so willing to defend land in this way. I think for me, it's also very important to understand the history of, you know, how different Haudenosaunee people have ended up in different places, you know, in these small areas of our vast territory. And what's very interesting, I guess, as I've grown and learned, is how we relate to one another and how our clan system intersects across these territories, and how we have these reciprocal relationships that are governed by our laws through our, you know, within the titles of our confederacy, but then also how that dictates our relationships and our interdependence and accountability to one another. And that continues to transcend miles and territories. One of the things that's really important to consider with that is that our relationships extend into other Haudenosaunee reserves, but then also you know, to people that live off reserve as well. And so we have those ways that we travel across our communities, between our communities, and support one another in very big ways, like our you know, land defense actions, and how even earlier the year Haudenosaunee were active in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en, but in very small ways as well, in how we conduct every ceremonies, and how we look to each other in times of need based on our clan system. And so I think that that's all interwoven into this. And the fact that there are so many Haudenosaunee that continue to exist within that clan structure, it's a really, that for me becomes foundational in how we move forward, and that we look to the ways, there's very specific ways that those structures have been undermined, and the very specific efforts that we can take to revitalize them. And I'll just give one example. So the federal government disrupted Haudenosaunee matrilineal processes by imposing Indian status. And so for many generations, people had their identity recorded as patrilineal, even though we're a matrilineal society. And so equipping people in communities with the ability to determine what their actual clan identity is, and to take on that onus as the federal government to correct that disruption, is a very powerful way that communities, individuals who were disconnected from our traditional ways, could be reconnected and begin to revitalize and make even stronger those clan connections. A little bit sideways, but yeah, that's what I have. Mm-hmm.
Now, Courtney. So we do have a question that's come about, and I'll try to figure out. The first one: what is the plan if the injunction goes through and the militarized police continue to enforce the development? How can allies best help the fight? And Courtney, that's probably the best question for you to take on.
Yeah. So Skylar Williams is the spokesperson for the action. And he's repeatedly said in the media and in his social media that the Haudenosaunee have existed in this land for 10,000 years, and he expects they'll be there for 10,000 more. The land defenders at 1492 Landback Lane have built a house there. They've built their own infrastructure there, and they intend on staying. And so unless the state is going to arrest and forcibly remove every single Haudenosaunee person from there and jail them indefinitely, this is going to be a conflict that's continuing. It's going to continue to take place. And as long as the OPP are the ones who are leading the state response to it, it's going to continue to be what it has been. You know, we're in a cycle right now of police violence and Indigenous reactions to it. And what happens when you see things like, you know, burning tires in the media and that kind of stuff is just like the reaction of 400 years of oppression in individuals that see their loved ones arrested and criminalized. And so that's where we are right now. That's a trajectory we're on, where the land defenders are going to continue to be on the land, continue to reassert themselves into that territory. And so we really need, you know, or they have called for repeatedly for allies to put pressure on their own governance. So if there are allies who don't want to see this continue, to contact their MPs and their governance structures to tell them this is unacceptable, and that taking 30 years to settle these like disputed lands is far too long, and that where possible, these lands should be returned to the Haudenosaunee, especially in this land that is the Haldeman Tract that was supposed to be a place of safety and refuge for the Haudenosaunee, which is probably some of the most developed land in Canada.
Now, Courtney, the next question that I'd like to pose to all of our panelists is a question of commenting or criticizing the undermining of Indigenous land reclamation by colonialist mainstream media. And Courtney, obviously you just touched on that a bit, but Dale or Kevin, is there anything that you would like to add to that discussion about the role of mainstream media and the promotion of the land actions as criminal?
Okay, well, I guess I'll say just something about. I think that when you look at the fact that Section 35 is the Constitution protects Aboriginal rights, but it also protects the treaty relationship, and the treaties include treaties that predate the formation of the Canadian state. So when John Burroughs says that, colonial law gains its sort of presence in virtue of Indigenous law, that's the way we need to look at this. And so the treaty relationship is protected in the Constitution. But what happens is that certain practices and concepts, such as the duty to consult, which I see as a duty to con and a duty to insult, but bring them together. But and the honor of the crown, these kinds of concepts have come out of that discourse or language, right? That we start getting with some, once we get case law. But what they do is they are used by the state to constrain, as you said, the injunctions. The duty to consult is bypassed by particular role that injunctions play. So once the criminalization then occurs within that sort of narrow interpretation of Indigenous rights in Canada. Whereas if you take this broader, certainly Indigenous interpretations of the treaties, then the legitimacy of them defending their homelands arises out of the sanctity of the treaty relationship, of which one part of that treaty relationship is protecting their nationhood. So the criminality then is understood within sort of a black letter interpretation of the law, ignoring the very language that they use to characterize the relationship, which is this language of inherent recognition and so on.
Now for that, Dale. We actually are coming close to the end of our time. And again, in our procedures, we will close with the Thanksgiving from Eileen. But before I call her on to do that, I did want to send acknowledgements and appreciation to the people who are physically present on the land at 1492 Lamback Lane, to their families, their children, their parents, their grandparents, their neighbors, aunties and uncles who are stepping in to take care of their families while they are taking care of our land. And all those people who you aren't going to read about in the press who are doing things behind the scenes because they are upholding their responsibilities. They're doing what it is that we were told at the time of creation that we have responsibilities to do. And I wanted to acknowledge that. And I also wanted to acknowledge that as Haudenosaunee people in particular, but as Indigenous people more broadly, that we recognize that this land that we all operate on, everyone who's on the panel today was present physically, either at Oneida Territory or in Toronto, that this was a land of peace and that we have a primary responsibility to advocate for peace. And that includes supporting the work of Black Lives Matter, supporting the work of Indigenous Lives Matter, and recognizing that any people who get to enjoy the bounty of this territory have a responsibility to protect and sustain life. And that's the position that we take always, and that is a primary piece of the thinking behind the work that's happening at 1492 Lamback Lane. So with that, I also wanted to acknowledge the tireless work of folks to put together the Scholar Strike activities, the teach-in. We've been so grateful for particularly the tech support that we've had and the guidance that we've received there, and wanted to acknowledge those folks. And lastly, also to acknowledge our colleague Pamela Clausen, who is the chair of the Department for the Study of Religion, who organized us and got us going on this. So nyawa for that. And I will now turn it over to Eileen to close things for us in a good way. Nyawa.
At this time, again, it's been just so wonderful to hear all of the information that has been shared. And we give thanks to Sigourney and Dizzle for these panelists that have taken this opportunity to talk about and share the information and knowledge that helps us to give better understanding to the situation that is happening when we talk about the issues that fallen promises on treaty land have presented to us today. And so we give thanks for these people. We give thanks. We always give thanks for Mother Earth because, again, she carried out her duties and responsibilities while we met here. And we give thanks also for the things of the land, the water, the plants, the animals, because again, we know that we have a relationship with these people, with these parts of creation. And so as we gather our minds, we give thanks that they continue to carry out their duties and responsibilities while we were able to meet today. We give thanks also for the things above the land, our elder brother, the sun, the thunderers, our ancestors, our grandmother, the moon, who continues to carry out her duties and responsibilities, our ancestors, because again, we know that they are all important and that we need to acknowledge all our relationships. And so we give thanks again for all of these things because it's important to us, for us to realize our relationship with all of creation, with all of the people in this land, and to know that we are all important to what happens here. And in our societies, we talk about power, peace, and righteousness. That is what our law is based on. And so we remember that the power is our power of relationship. The peace is our peace that we can have with each other in our relationship. And the righteousness that we put these all together in order to make a place that is safe for all peoples. And so as we gather our minds, we give thanks for all of these things and for all of the information and that has been shared. We just give thanks to Sigwe and Dizzle for bringing us together and for having the panelists share all of this information with us. And at this time, I say, Nyawa, Miigwech, thank you. I just want to say also that it's been really a wonderful experience knowing these things. Nyawa.